January 17, 1944. Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, Territory of Hawaii. The morning sun broke across the harbor waters in ribbons of copper and gold, casting long shadows over the steel monuments that rose from the Pacific's edge. A Japanese reconnaissance photograph, captured months earlier by a downed aircraft and later recovered by American forces, showed this same harbor, but the image bore no resemblance to what now stretched across the waterline. Where 3 years prior, the twisted wreckage of the Arizona had marked America's darkest hour, there now floated a forest of gray hulls. 17 aircraft carriers, their flight decks gleaming with fresh paint, their hulls still smelling of welding torches and rivets, sat in formation like a steel archipelago. The sound that morning was not of sirens or explosions, but of industry, the rhythmic clanging of final adjustments, the shouts of deck crews, the roar of aircraft engines being tested for the first time in combat conditions. No harbor in human history had ever witnessed such a congregation of naval power assembled in a single year. The carriers bore names that would echo through the decades: Essex, Lexington II, Bunker Hill, Wasp II, Yorktown II, names that carried the ghosts of sunken predecessors, now reborn in steel and determination. In Tokyo, in the war rooms where maps covered entire walls and miniature ships marked the shrinking perimeter of the Japanese Empire, the admirals who had planned the assault on Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier now stared at intelligence reports they could not reconcile with reality. Vice Admiral Mato Megaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto until his death, wrote in his diary that winter, "The reports from our reconnaissance units speak of American carrier strength that exceeds our entire pre-war estimates of their construction capacity. Either our intelligence services have failed completely, or we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy we face." The words carried the weight of dawning comprehension, the terrible understanding that the war Japan had initiated was not the war they were now fighting. The conflict had transformed into something beyond the scope of traditional naval warfare, beyond the calculus of ship-to-ship combat and tactical brilliance. It had become an industrial siege, a contest not of warrior spirit but of factory floors, assembly lines, and production quotas that operated 24 hours a day across a continent that Japanese planners had dismissed as soft, divided, and incapable of sustained sacrifice. The story of this miscalculation begins not in 1944, but in the 1930s, in the mahogany-paneled offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Planning Division, where a generation of officers trained in the traditions of samurai warfare attempted to calculate the industrial capacity of a nation they had never truly understood. Japanese naval doctrine, refined over decades and perfected in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, emphasized quality over quantity, the superiority of spirit over material, the decisive battle in which superior training and tactical excellence would overcome numerical disadvantage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the most America-experienced officer in the Japanese Navy, had warned his colleagues that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but could not sustain a prolonged conflict with American industrial might. His warnings, prophetic as they would prove, were filtered through a cultural lens that simply could not comprehend the scale of what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. Japanese intelligence estimates in 1941 projected that the United States might construct 8 to 10 fleet carriers during the course of a 4-year war. This estimate was not born of laziness or incompetence, but of a fundamental inability to imagine an economic system that could simultaneously fight a two-ocean war, supply allies across 3 continents, maintain civilian production, and expand military manufacturing at rates that exceeded the total pre-war production of all Axis powers combined. The Japanese admirals expected to face an America weakened by internal division, hamstrung by democratic indecision, crippled by the luxury and softness they believed inherent in democratic capitalism. They had studied American newspapers, read accounts of labor strikes, observed the isolationist movements that had kept America out of European wars. They knew that American shipyards in 1939 had produced fewer than 24 major warships. They understood that the American Navy, while large, operated with peacetime inefficiency, that American sailors lacked the combat experience of Japanese naval forces, that American industry, while vast, had never been tested in total war. What they could not imagine, what lay beyond the conceptual framework of their military education, was that these perceived weaknesses would become strengths, that the very characteristics they dismissed as decadence would prove to be the wellspring of unprecedented productive power. They expected America to negotiate, to seek compromise, to weary of casualties and return to its isolationist slumber. Instead, Pearl Harbor ignited a transformation so total, so complete, that by 1944 the United States was producing more military tonnage every month than Japan had constructed in the entire decade before the war. The carriers that filled Pearl Harbor that January morning were the visible manifestation of a miracle of industrial coordination that had begun in darkened Washington offices in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized by Congress in 1940, had been conceived as a long-term building program that would mature in the mid-1940s. But December 7, 1941, compressed timelines that military planners had assumed were fixed by the laws of physics and engineering. The Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia, which had required 26 months to construct the carrier Yorktown in the late 1930s, now completed the Essex-class carriers in 16 months from keel-laying to commissioning. Kaiser Shipyards in Oregon, which had never built a carrier before 1942, employed construction techniques borrowed from bridge building and dam construction, prefabricating entire sections of hull and superstructure inland, then assembling them at the waterfront like pieces of a colossal puzzle. The introduction of welding instead of riveting, the standardization of components across multiple shipyards, the training of workers who had never seen a ship before Pearl Harbor, all of these innovations compressed construction timelines that naval architects had assumed were immutable. But the numbers alone do not capture what the Japanese admirals failed to understand. In March 1944, Lieutenant Commander Tomichihara, captain of the destroyer Shigeru and one of the most experienced surviving Japanese naval officers, recorded his observations after an engagement near Truk. "We sank 2 of their carriers in this action, a success that would have crippled their Pacific operations a year ago." Intelligence reports the next day indicated that 4 new American carriers had already been assigned to replace our kills, with 3 more completing their trials. It is as if we are fighting not a navy but an endless factory, one that repairs losses before we can even report our victories. Our sailors fight with the desperation of men who know that each victory is meaningless, that each American ship we send to the bottom is already replaced by 2 more that we cannot see, cannot reach, cannot stop. This was the psychological transformation that Japanese military leadership had not anticipated, the corrosive effect on morale when tactical victories produced no strategic progress, when every successful battle brought the defeat closer rather than pushing it away. The 17 carriers that crowded Pearl Harbor represented more than just ship construction. Each carrier required an air wing of 90 aircraft. Each aircraft required trained pilots, trained mechanics, trained ordnance handlers. Each ship required a crew of 3,000 sailors, trained in damage control, anti-aircraft warfare, navigation, engineering. The total personnel requirement for 17 carriers exceeded 100,000 men, and the United States Navy had trained them all in less than 2 years, while simultaneously expanding its battleship fleet, its cruiser squadrons, its destroyer screens, its submarine force. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with the finest carrier pilots in the world, lost irreplaceable veterans at Midway, at the Coral Sea, at Guadalcanal, and could not replace them. American carrier aviation, which had begun the war with undertrained pilots flying obsolescent aircraft, now fielded squadrons of Hellcat and Corsair fighters flown by pilots who had trained on unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited aircraft. The asymmetry was not merely numerical, it was qualitative, educational, institutional. Admiral Soma Toyota, who assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944, inherited a strategic situation that his predecessors' miscalculations had created. He wrote in his classified assessment that month, "We face an enemy who treats aircraft carriers as we treat destroyers, as expendable units to be replaced as needed rather than precious capital ships to be preserved at all costs." Our doctrine has no answer for this philosophy. When they lose a carrier, they mourn the crew but replace the ship. When we lose a carrier, we lose years of construction capacity that can never be recovered. The mathematics of this exchange are destroying us. This was the essential miscalculation stripped to its core. The Japanese had planned for a war against American strategy, American tactics, American naval tradition. They had not planned for a war against American factories, American training facilities, American resource extraction, American agricultural surplus, American industrial management systems. They had prepared to fight the American Navy. Instead, they found themselves fighting the American economy, and the economy was winning. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese naval officers in their private writings was not a weapon but a logistical detail: the ice cream. American carriers, they learned through prisoner interrogations and captured documents, carried ice cream machines. The Lexington, sunk at Coral Sea, had operated its own ice cream parlor for the crew. The Essex-class carriers included cold storage facilities that could produce thousands of gallons of ice cream per week. To Japanese sailors, subsisting on diminishing rice rations and increasingly polluted water, the ice cream became a symbol of an enemy who could afford luxuries in war that Japan could not provide in peace. It appeared in diaries, in letters home, in the bitter jokes that circulated through the combined fleet. "They eat ice cream while bombing us," wrote one Japanese officer recovered from a sunken cruiser. "What kind of nation fights a war with ice cream? How can Bushido prevail against ice cream?" The question was rhetorical, bitter, but it captured a truth that Japanese strategic planning had missed: that American abundance was not a weakness but a source of strength, that a nation wealthy enough to serve ice cream to sailors could afford to build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. By June 1944, when American forces invaded the Marianas and triggered the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the transformation was complete. The Japanese committed 9 carriers to the battle, virtually everything that remained of their once mighty carrier force. The Americans responded with 15 carriers, holding 2 more in reserve. The battle, which American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers and over 400 Japanese aircraft, against American losses of 123 aircraft and no carriers. But the numerical disparity was only part of the story. The Americans recovered most of their downed pilots. The Japanese lost the replaceable veterans and their aircraft, and the pilots who died with them represented training investments that Japan could no longer afford to make. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the American Carrier Task Force, reported after the battle, "The enemy fought with skill and courage, but they are fighting a losing battle against arithmetic. For every plane we lose, we have 3 more in the hangar ready to launch. For every plane they lose, they have an empty deck and a pilot who cannot be replaced. This is not a war anymore, it is mathematics with explosions." The Japanese admirals who had underestimated American industry did not survive to see the final arithmetic. Admiral Yamamoto, the most prescient of them, had been killed in April 1943 when American codebreakers intercepted his flight plans and P-38 fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. His death removed the one senior officer who truly understood what Japan had unleashed at Pearl Harbor, the one admiral who might have convinced the military government to seek peace before the destruction became total. Admiral Koga, his successor, died in a plane crash in March 1944, taking with him the operational plans for Japan's defense of the Philippines. The admirals who remained, Toyota, Agaki, Ozawa, were competent officers executing impossible strategies, trying to win battles that could not change the outcome of a war already decided in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of Norfolk, the training facilities of Pensacola. The final, terrible irony of the miscalculation revealed itself in the autumn of 1944, when American forces returned to the Philippines and the Imperial Japanese Navy committed its remaining surface fleet to a desperate gamble at Leyte Gulf. The Japanese plan, brilliant in its conception, nearly succeeded in its tactical objectives, but even success would have been strategic failure. If the Japanese battleships had reached the American landing beaches, if they had destroyed the invasion transports, if they had achieved the decisive surface action that Japanese doctrine demanded, the Americans would have returned with more ships, more planes, more men. By October 1944, the United States had not 17 but over 30 fleet and light carriers in commission, with more completing every month. The Japanese knew this. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force at Leyte Gulf, wrote after the battle, "We fought not to win, but to die with honor, to demonstrate that Japanese spirit had not been broken even when Japanese strategy had clearly failed." The Americans seemed almost embarrassed by the one-sidedness of our encounter, as if they pitied us. This pity was more devastating than their bombs. The symbolic ice cream appeared one final time in the historical record during the occupation of Japan. When American carriers arrived in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony in September 1945, sailors distributed ice cream to Japanese civilians, including to children who had never tasted it before. Photographs from that day showed Japanese children, wide-eyed and uncertain, being handed cones of vanilla ice cream by American sailors who smiled and joked in a language the children could not understand. The journalists who witnessed these scenes reported them as evidence of American generosity, of the magnanimity of victory. But the children's parents, the surviving officers and enlisted men of the Imperial Japanese Navy who watched from shore, understood the deeper symbolism. The ice cream represented everything the admirals had failed to calculate: the surplus, the abundance, the casual disposal of resources that Japan had hoarded like treasures. An American sailor could give away his ice cream ration because there was always more. A Japanese sailor had fought the entire war without tasting it once. In the decades after the war, as historians analyzed the intelligence failures and strategic miscalculations that led Japan to defeat, they focused on specific decisions, specific battles, specific moments where different choices might have altered outcomes. They studied Midway, where Japan lost 4 carriers and the strategic initiative. They analyzed the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, which unified American public opinion and guaranteed total war rather than negotiated peace. They examined the resource calculations, the oil embargoes, the expansion into Southeast Asia. All of these analyses were valid, all contributed to understanding, but they missed the fundamental miscalculation that preceded them all. The Japanese admirals did not merely underestimate American shipbuilding capacity or industrial production or resource extraction. They underestimated the idea that powered all of those material advantages, the idea that free people, working voluntarily in their own interests, could outproduce slaves and conscripts working under coercion, that democratic capitalism, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, could mobilize resources more effectively than military dictatorship, that the very characteristics they dismissed as weakness, the labor unions, the competitive markets, the civilian oversight, the freedom of speech and assembly, created resilience and adaptability that rigid hierarchical systems could not match. The 17 carriers that filled Pearl Harbor in January 1944 were not merely ships. They were arguments made in steel, propositions about how societies organize themselves, demonstrations of what free labor could achieve when working toward a common purpose. Each carrier represented thousands of workers who had chosen their employment. Engineers who had improved designs through open debate, managers who had competed for contracts through superior efficiency, politicians who had authorized spending knowing they would face voters in the next election. The Japanese system had no equivalent institutions, no mechanisms for this kind of distributed decision-making, no faith in the power of individual initiative acting without coercion. The admirals had assumed that discipline and hierarchy would overcome democratic chaos, that the purity of their purpose would defeat material abundance. They were wrong, and the 17 carriers were the proof of their error, floating in the harbor where the war had begun, preparing to deliver the final arguments in a debate that had already been settled. On the evening of January 17, 1944, as the last of the 17 carriers completed preparations to depart Pearl Harbor for the Western Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, stood on the deck of his flagship and watched the sun set over the armada he commanded. An aide asked him if he felt satisfaction at the sight, at the overwhelming superiority the United States now enjoyed. Nimitz, who had witnessed the burning wrecks 3 years earlier, who had salvaged American strategy from the ashes of defeat, did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, "The Japanese taught us a lesson on December 7th that we have now mastered, that wars are not won by the bravest soldiers or the most brilliant generals, but by the side that can sustain losses and continue fighting, that can replace what is destroyed faster than the enemy can destroy it. They attacked us believing we would collapse, that our wealth had made us weak. They did not understand that our wealth was our strength, that the factories and farms and universities they dismissed as proof of decadence were actually the foundations of power they could never match. These 17 carriers are not revenge, they are education. We are teaching them what they taught us, and the lesson will be bitter." The lesson was bitter indeed, delivered in fire and steel across the breadth of the Pacific, in the names of islands that became synonyms for sacrifice: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The carriers that departed Pearl Harbor that January participated in every major operation of 1944 and 1945, their aircraft striking targets across thousands of miles of ocean, their presence forcing Japanese forces into defensive positions that could not hold. By the end of the war, the United States Navy operated more than 100 aircraft carriers of all types, a fleet larger than all other navies in the world combined. Japan, which had begun the war with 10 carriers and the finest naval aviation in the world, finished with none, the last surviving carriers converted to transport ships, their flight decks empty of aircraft, their pilots gone. The admirals who had miscalculated did not live to see the final accounting. Some died in battle, some in aircraft accidents, some by their own hand as defeat became inevitable and honor demanded the ultimate price. Those who survived to witness the surrender carried with them the knowledge of their failure, the understanding that they had led their nation into a war that could not be won, that should not have been fought, that destroyed Japan more completely than any foreign invasion could have achieved. In their private writings, in the memoirs published decades later when wounds had scarred over if not healed, they returned again and again to the same theme: the factories they had not counted, the workers they had dismissed, the productive capacity they had not imagined possible. They had prepared to fight American admirals. They had not prepared to fight American factories, American farms, American universities, American freedom. And in that failure of imagination lay the seeds of their complete defeat. The 17 carriers of January 1944 represent a larger truth about the nature of power in the modern world, a truth that authoritarian regimes repeatedly fail to grasp and free societies repeatedly forget. Power is not merely military strength or tactical brilliance or warrior spirit. Power is the capacity to sustain effort over time, to replace losses, to adapt to circumstances, to mobilize resources voluntarily rather than through coercion. The Japanese admirals were not fools. They were brilliant strategists working within a framework that could not accommodate the reality they faced. They could not imagine that ice cream on a warship represented a deeper form of power than all the samurai traditions they revered, that abundance mattered more than austerity, that the voluntary cooperation of free people could outproduce the forced labor of an empire. The 17 carriers taught them this lesson, one burning island at a time, one sunk ship at a time, one empty sky at a time. By the time they learned, it was too late for the lesson to save them. The war they had begun with confidence and careful calculation ended with their cities in ruins, their fleet at the bottom of the Pacific, their empire dissolved, their miscalculation complete. The harbor where it began is now a memorial, where tourists come to see the sunken ships and remember the dead. But on that January morning in 1944, with 17 carriers crowding the waterline, Pearl Harbor was not a memorial but a promise that the attack of December 7th would be answered, that the calculation error of the Japanese admirals would be corrected with compound interest, that the nation they had dismissed as decadent would prove resilient beyond their comprehension. The carriers delivered on that promise, crossing the Pacific like judgment itself, carrying with them not merely bombs and bullets but an idea, the idea that free people, working together voluntarily, could defeat tyranny not through matching its brutality but by exceeding its capacity, by outproducing, outlasting, overwhelming it with the sheer abundance that freedom makes possible. The Japanese admirals had underestimated American industry. In doing so, they had underestimated something far more fundamental: the power of freedom itself.